How do you make a table like this shorter? This is going to be a fun one.
My neighbor's wife thrifted this table. She's obsessed with it. The only problem is it's about 4 inches too tall for the area they have it in. So my neighbor asked me if I could cut this down. So here we are. I'll start by unbolting the table pedestal from the tabletop. There are 3 Allen head screws, and then in one corner there's this funky little bolt. So I took that out as well. And once those were free, I could lift up the entire pedestal, and then there were 3 bolts that attached the pedestal to this, I don't know what you want to call it, this piece of plywood is what it is. So I pulled those as well. Then I flipped the pedestal over to get access to the bottom where the feet attach, and I'm going to take these feet off. I want to get to the pedestal itself all alone so that I can cut the pedestal down and attach it back to the table. Now I'm going to go ahead and mark the center line on the top of this pedestal. This is a clever little device. It references off 2 of the edges, and by marking it a few times you get your center mark in the center of a circle. And once I had the center mark, I took a sharp awl and I poked the end of it to give myself a little indentation point. I'm going to do the cutting on the lathe, so I went ahead and put this into the chuck. You should not try and turn this by the chuck alone. It is so wobbly. So I'm going to pinch it between the chuck and the tailstock, and that will be basically like turning between centers, even though I have a chuck instead of a drive spur on one end. I tightened that chuck up until I could hear the wood fibers crushing a little bit just to give some strength. I didn't want to go too hard and burst apart this pedestal, however. Then I figured out where 4 inches down on the pedestal would land me with the help of a square and a ruler, and I put a mark there. And I'm going to transfer that mark all around to the different flutes. Once this piece starts spinning, I'll be able to see that line very easily as I go to make my cut. I'm going to be using a parting tool to cut this off, and I want to get it razor sharp before I begin my cutting. So I spent a few moments sharpening it here, and once it was sharp, it's lathe time. I bring my tool rest in nice and close, make sure it's the right height, and then before I start it, I rotate it by hand just to make sure I'm not bumping into anything. When I first make this cut, I'm cutting a lot of air because those flutes are not solid. So I want to make my first cut especially very slow until I'm down to solid wood. I'm beating on it right here because the base of this pedestal is hollow. I think this decorative piece I'm cutting is probably solid, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to come through unexpectedly and have 2 pieces wobbling around on the lathe, which is why I was beating it to see if I could hear fibers snapping at all. You'll notice I've widened the kerf out. That keeps the tool from binding in the cut, and it's easier to see what you're doing. You also may notice the angle I'm cutting at will result in a slightly concave pedestal, and that is what I want. If it turns out convex, then the plywood that sits on top of this will have a tendency to rock, whereas with concave it has a firm rim to rest on all around. Of course I don't want it too concave, I just don't want any part of the center to be higher than any part on the edge. As I'm getting close to the center, the tool is bouncing up and down in my hands quite a bit. That's because I'm sticking relatively far over the tool rest and I have very little handle to hold on to. So at this point, I'll go ahead and stop the lathe and I'll use a saw to cut off the rest. This is a Japanese style saw, very thin and flexible blade, and I'm using my fingers to flex that blade in a curve so I don't damage the rim of this pedestal as I cut through the center. Instead of putting those threaded inserts back in for the bolts, I'm going to drill some holes closer together because the pedestal is now the smaller diameter. So I'll drill 3 new holes closer together, and I'll use some structural screws to attach it to the plywood. And now it's pretty much in reverse, putting everything back together. I'll put the legs in together, then I'll set the whole top back on the tabletop and tighten it down. But this time, because there were 3 bolts in the pedestal that I ended up using structural screws in place of, I'm going to use one of those Allen bolts here so I can avoid that funky bolt that was in here earlier. And then just for kicks, I decided to weigh all the extra parts and hardware, which came to a whopping 1.07 pounds. And here's the finished table. Yes, you can see that the pedestal has been cut, but by the time you get low enough to see it's been cut, you can see the bottom of the table anyway.
That's how you shorten this type of table. If you like content like this, please subscribe. We're always doing something fun. You're welcome to join us.